Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Murrell here with a spoiler review of Disclosure Day, which is the new movie from Steven Spielberg. It opened on Friday. I did my review on Tuesday when the embargo was initially lifted. And to be honest, I wasn't necessarily planning to do a spoiler review, but there has been so much interest in this movie. So many people watched the review, and the response to it has been so passionate that I decided I wanted to do another video talking full spoilers about the film, which, by the way, I will be doing. If you haven't seen Disclosure Day, you should tune out now because I'm going to talk about all of the reveals in the movie I couldn't talk about in my non-spoiler review. And one of the reasons that I wanted to go into it is that the response to this film has been kind of rare because a lot of times if I like a movie or if I don't like a movie, when I get the feedback from people once they've seen it, I'll get a lot of people saying, yeah, I really liked it, or yeah, I didn't like it. Kind of a varied, mix of responses. But what I've gotten with this movie is maybe the most, as far as comments go, universally negative response to a movie I've seen in a really long time. And not just a little negative, like people saying like, it was horrible, I hated it, I wanted to walk out of it. It's really unusual. I think it might have to do with a few different things. Number one, I think that the film drew in an audience that was made up of a lot of different groups. Some people that were sort of in the alien space that were drawn to the movie, a lot of people in the conspiracy space that were drawn to the whole Disclosure Day part of it. I've seen a lot of response from people on the religious side of things who didn't like it for various reasons. Then you had the fact that I think the trailer for the film promised a different kind of movie than maybe it ultimately delivered. And that is an expectation issue. So you have some people that didn't like it for reasons that might be kind of tangentially connected to the movie or what it's about. Some people that were disappointed by the movie that the trailer promised versus the one that it delivered. And then the usual mix of people that liked or didn't like the movie. But the churn has been so negative, I think, because it was kind of a perfect storm of people that just weren't really pleased with what Steven Spielberg delivered. I talk a lot on the channel about expectations and how the audience response to a film, especially on opening weekend, is tied to expectation. That's really what Cinema Score is a measure of. Disclosure Day got a Cinema Score of B, which is not terrible, but not great for a big movie like this. It's the same score that Masters of the Universe got, for example. That was a movie, by the way, that got a mostly positive response in the comments section. My expectation going into the movie, first and foremost, was to watch a Spielberg movie. And I think that, and I'm going to go into the reasons why, it delivered for me. But I think that there were a lot of people that were going in expecting things having more to do with the alien side of it, where it didn't meet those expectations. And that's one of the reasons I say that film is so subjective, because even how you respond to a film can ride on what you individually were expecting out of that film. Now, I will be the first to acknowledge that Disclosure Day is absolutely not a perfect film, but there were a lot of things in it that I really, really liked. There were some things in it that I thought were just okay, and there were a few things that I thought were pretty subpar. So let's dive down into it, and we'll start with the things in the movie that I really, really liked, that I really enjoyed, and that's ultimately what put me over the top on this film with my It's Good rating and a recommendation for the movie. And for me, the list has to start with Emily Blunt. I said in my review that I think that this is the best performance that she's ever put on film, and I still think that it is. And it's because she has to hit so many different notes. The first act of the movie basically is like a comedic performance. I mean, she's playing this, weather reporter who wants to do something more. There's a lot of humor with her character and in her interactions with her boyfriend and with her coworkers. But then we quickly shift, once she is able to read people's emotions, into this area that's still kind of comedy, but she's going back and forth into speaking all these different languages, but she doesn't quite know what she's doing. So she gets to play the comedy of like being an absolute expert on all of these things, then play the comedy of not knowing what she just did. But as we go into Act 2, that performance changes dramatically because she starts becoming scared by her abilities and overwhelmed. She doesn't know what's going on. And that comedic performance gives way to what I think is a really, really strong dramatic performance. And it's really anchored by that scene on the train where she has that complete emotional breakdown, which I thought was a great piece of acting for her. And then going into the third act, she almost becomes like the authority once she realizes what's going on, what her abilities are, what she's able to do, what her role in the end game is. She almost becomes this wise figure, second only really to the alien that they card out at the end. I understand that people have an issue with specific events and things that happen in the movie, but I think you'd be really hard pressed to argue that even if you hated everything that did happen in the movie, that Emily Blunt didn't put in a good performance, because she is a big reason why the movie worked as well as it did for me, because she sold everything so convincingly. I also think that Act 2 of the movie was really strong. I would say actually it's a great act. The first act of the film was intriguing. The third act, a little bit less so. But the second act is really what I think kicked the whole movie into gear. It's what hooked me. It's where the movie was really firing on all cylinders. I love the sequence where Colin Firth was able to get into Eve Hewson's head and the suspense around that. I thought the editing on that was great, the cinematography. I love the car chase sequence as they were getting out of the farm, as well as the train action sequence with Josh O'Connor and Emily Blunt. And I think that the script did a really good job at building the mystery in the middle of the film with Emily Blunt's character and trying to figure out what was happening with her. There was also a solid transition into the top of Act 3 with the invisible house set piece. I know some people probably found that a little bit too goofy, but I thought it worked as both an action set piece and a comedy set piece, and was really the last time the movie went big before we get into that more intimate finale of the film. So that middle chunk of the film, I think, worked so well that it helped me to maybe balance it with some of the shortcomings, not so much in the first act, but mainly in the third act. And when I'm looking at a movie on balance, that's something that I have to look at. What did I like? What did I not like? And in what proportion are those things? I also really enjoyed the music in the film. John Williams did not create a score here that was as memorable on the whole as, say, Jaws or Star Wars or E.T., but I thought he did a really good job with the score of setting the tone and setting the mood, and there were a couple of individual tracks that I really loved. They've actually released his entire score now on the internet, on YouTube and other places, I'm sure Spotify, etc. And I was able to find the track that I referenced in my non-spoiler review that played under the scene where Josh O'Connor and Emily Blunt sort of reunite. They don't know they're reuniting, but when they finally get together in the movie, that has that beautiful piano piece. It reminds me of the piano part in John Williams' E.T. score. And I'm sure that there was probably some intentionality there to sort of echo the alien work that John Williams has done with Steven Spielberg in the past. That piece of music specifically really struck a chord with me, and you can listen to that now on its own. So, as I said in the non-spoiler review, John Williams is a genius, breaking news. But I think that the score really worked for the film, even if it's not necessarily as iconic or doesn't really put an individual stamp on the music as much as some of his other scores. I also really like the cinematography. I mean, Janusz Kaminski is one of the best cinematographers I think ever. He has helped Steven Spielberg make his big studio musical with West Side Story, and I thought that his work was fantastic in that. The way that he used the sort of old-style Hollywood way of going out with the big crane shots and showing the big wide shots on the dance sequences. He's done war epics with Steven Spielberg, and this to me was him doing sort of a traditional classic, again, mostly an Act 2 action movie with Steven Spielberg, a practical action movie. And I think it's the most practical action that we've seen from Steven Spielberg in a long time. Ready Player One had a lot of action sequences, but most of those were very VFX heavy, whereas the ones in this film, in Disclosure Day, I think were very much about, driving cars out of practical sets. And, even the train sequence was a mix of practical and digital effects. So I like how Kaminski was able to help Spielberg shoot the action part of this film and generally the overall look of the film. I know that some people weren't really a fan and aren't a fan of how Janusz Kaminski does this kind of movie, and it does go back to his work on Minority Report and some of the other stuff. It's got lens flares and stuff, which J.J. Abrams kind of drove into the ground. But I thought that it was very moody, very atmospheric, and I liked the look of the movie. It didn't have that digital, glossy, washed-out look. I don't think that a lot of movies have these days. It felt very singular. It felt very artisanal, like there was a real craftsman behind the film. And again, it really helped to give the movie weight for me and give the sequences weight in a way that I think a more generic way of shooting the movie wouldn't have done. I was also a fan of the overall message of the movie. I know that a lot of people wanted or maybe expected something more complicated with the aliens and disclosure, and were disappointed that really it ended with this message to humanity. But I liked the idea of the aliens sort of revealing themselves to the world, to Earth at least, at a time when we were about to destroy ourselves. And they're basically saying, we want to give you an idea that there is something bigger out there. Now, Steven Spielberg, rightfully so, has a reputation from time to time, or maybe all the time, of laying it on a little too thick. I didn't think that he laid it on too thick in this movie. Now, it wasn't a subtle message, definitely, but it didn't hit me over the head in the way that a lot of the messages, especially the more sentimental messages in his other movies have done. And listen, this idea of just like, hey, humanity, you've got more in common, that can bring you together than divide you. And, you should practice empathy and love everybody, etc. That is corny. I get it. It's corny. It's kind of an old school boomer mentality, some might say. But I think that could be true and not necessarily be bad. And especially at a time when, there is a lot of division, I don't mind the idea of a movie saying, hey, let's imagine a story here where these fantastic events happen and humanity is able to unite behind them as being so bad. Now, I've seen a lot of people say that it was unbelievable because, well, nobody would believe it. They would think that it was AI. And I think that's probably part of the reason why Steven Spielberg made the movie, because in reality, that is probably true. But Steven Spielberg, at heart, has always sort of enjoyed making fairy tales and making things that are fantastical and otherworldly and are probably not how things would work in real life. But you can tell that like this is his vision of like, gee, wouldn't it be great if aliens existed and this was how they revealed themselves and this was humanity's response, that it ends on this note of hope that people will actually stop fighting each other, that they will listen to the aliens' message, and that we are going to advance into this new way of being. Corny, old-fashioned, sure. I'll grant you that. You're either going to go with it or you won't. I am a bit Pollyanna-ish sometimes in my view of the world, so I went with it. Now, I do have to say that I was fully expecting in the third act that there would be this revelation that Disclosure Day was set in the same world or, in the same storyline as Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that this movie just happened to take place 50 years after the events that we witnessed in Close Encounters, and that these were the same aliens that visited Richard Dreyfuss in that film. I'm not saying that Richard Dreyfuss would have to stroll into the studio at the end of the movie or anything like that, but I think that it actually kind of works. I mean, I think the aliens as depicted fit with the aliens that we saw in Close Encounters. There were similar things with Richard Dreyfuss's character in that movie and the characters in this film, as far as kind of having their life hijacked by these images that are put into their heads by the aliens that draw them and compel them to do certain things. And I think that it would have worked as a sort of symbolic bookend for Steven Spielberg to make this movie, Close Encounters, in 1977, his first movie after the breakout hit of Jaws. And then later in his career, I mean, hopefully we have a few more Spielberg movies, but he is in the later part of his career, to make a movie that is set in the same world 50 years later that shows us essentially the end of that story, the end game of the aliens. I understand why he didn't do it. It would raise a lot of questions and it would probably divide people. You can't really do the M. Night Shyamalan Split thing and do the stealth sequel revelation. But I really did think for a while that that's where we were going. And honestly, I wouldn't have hated it. Finally, if we're talking about things that I loved in the movie, I want to give another shout out to Courtney Grace. I talked about her in my non-spoiler review, but I couldn't really say what she did in the film. As we'll get into later on in this video, I do think that the third act of the movie was the weakest part of the film, and I think that it could have fallen really flat for me if the movie climaxed with us watching people watch videos with no emotional investment. I know that some people were already underwhelmed by that part of the film. And the reason that it worked for me, I think, can almost solely be boiled down to Courtney Grace's performance as that news anchor, because it would have been easy to sort of script generic dialogue. And really, I think when you look at the dialogue by the letter of the script, it's not necessarily the most outstanding dialogue, but her performance to me was utterly realistic as somebody whose job it is to convey to people watching at home what they're seeing, or to give their thoughts or give some context on it, and yet at the same time be utterly confused and scared and overwhelmed by what she's seeing on screen. It felt like an absolutely realistic portrait of somebody who is just thrust into the situation on live television that honestly doesn't know what to say or do, but has to say or do something. Just the believability of it is what kept me emotionally invested in that scene. And I think that her performance is one that's not necessarily going to be recognized a lot, and definitely won't be sort of on the award circuit, along with, honestly, Emily Blunt would probably be the only one that would be on the award circuit. But when I see an actor or a performer or an artist doing work that I think is really, really strong, maybe in a role that could easily be overlooked, I do want to give it attention and praise because they deserve to have that attention and praise, especially because, as I said, in many ways, the ending of the film was reliant on her making it believable pretty much on her own. All right, so those are some of the things that I thought were really, really good in the film. Let's go to some of the things that I thought were just okay, and we'll start with Josh O'Connor. And this is nothing against Josh O'Connor. I think he's a really good actor. This wasn't really his fault, but his character was just so flimsy. I mean, he was basically just the motivation for what everybody else was doing. Colin Firth and Emily Blunt were looking for him. He was the conduit through which the information of what was going on and this thing that he stole and aliens exist. His job was to share that with other characters and by extension the audience, and I don't feel like we got to know him much apart from that. Emily Blunt, I felt like we did. We got to know who she was and sort of her personality and a little bit more about her past, but he was also just kind of there because he had to be the other half of the equation, no pun intended, and I just don't think that it allowed him to really flex his acting muscles as much as Emily Blunt got the opportunity to do. I also thought the aliens were just okay. Once I realized that this wasn't tied into Close Encounters, I did think that it was a little cliche for Steven Spielberg to use that typical gray alien design. I suppose it's because he wanted to tie it into the existing alien mythology and make it feel more real, because that alien design is what people imagine when they think of aliens. But to me, it sort of showed a lack of imagination, and it put the ending of the movie at the risk of being kind of comical. When they wheeled that alien out, that old alien, and they unzipped the thing and he looked like the big gray-headed, big-eyed alien that's been seen so many times, it did run the risk of becoming unintentionally humorous. And I've read that it was unintentionally humorous for a lot of people. I was certainly fighting my own feelings in that moment. I was just like, oh, I don't know about this. It's only because I liked what the ultimate conclusion of that was that I was like, okay, well, I like the idea of this and I like how it wrapped up enough that I can sort of overlook the concept of wheeling out this very cliche alien that's been used in comedies, animation, South Park, you name it, so many times before. I think it would have been more effective for me if Steven Spielberg had gone with his own alien design that was maybe a little bit different from the traditional ones, and that could have distanced it a little bit from what's been parodied and portrayed in so many other films before. I also thought generally the supporting characters were just okay. There were a lot of really good actors playing those roles, but they didn't have much to do. Coleman Domingo, magnetic as hell. I liked him in the movie, but I never really felt much for his character. He was just kind of the overseer who had all the answers. I could have used a little bit more about him personally. Eve Houston was good, but she just sort of disappears when she needs to disappear and magically reappears to give Emily Blunt the magic plot device at the end. We'll talk more about that later. Same with Wyatt Russell. I really liked his dynamic with Emily Blunt, but then she ditches him and we never see him again except for that obligatory shot in Act 3 that movies do to remind us that he was in the movie. And Colin Firth, I mean, I think he was probably the strongest of the supporting characters, and I thought he was genuinely menacing, but I think that even he could have been rounded out some more. Still, I'm putting them in the okay category because even though I didn't think their characters were that great on the page, they were all played by actors who gave what I thought were good performances. But that does take us to what I thought wasn't so great in the movie, and we'll start with something that I think almost everybody can agree on. The visual effects for the animals in the film, they were distractingly fake. Now, you could say that since they weren't supposed to be real animals, but aliens pretending to be animals, that the uncanny look was on purpose, and we did get a bit of that storybook feel with the Hansel and Gretel house when they go in for their experimentation as kids. But I honestly think the reason is that digital effects haven't really been able to consistently replicate what real creatures look like, whether that's people or animals or whatever. And especially with animals, I mean, there's so many variables with fur, and how do you make fur look realistic? I think that it can be done, but you have to give your visual effects artists the time and the budget to do that properly. And it didn't feel to me like Disclosure Day was able to do that. I think that the animals looked the way that they did either because the visual effects artists weren't given the proper resources, or there was a creative decision to make them look sort of fake and uncanny. But either way, that was bad decision making, and especially because those animals were so crucial to key parts of the movies, it really did risk derailing those parts of the film, and it did undercut the impact of those parts of the movie for me personally. And the writing of Act 3, I didn't think was great. David Koepp is an incredibly streaky screenwriter, and Act 3 showed off what I think were a lot of his biggest weaknesses. The magic alien device worked when its purpose was just to allow communication between people, but I think when it turned into a sonic screwdriver that could do anything, I rolled my eyes a little. I mean, the invisibility thing I went with because it was a good set piece. But when Eve Hewson ran in with it and gave it to Emily Blunt, Emily Blunt just held it up to turn the power back on and was like, oh, that's how we solve this problem. I audibly groaned in the theater because that to me is just lazy screenwriting. I just hated it because it seemed like David Koepp wrote himself into a cheap solution for a problem that didn't necessarily need to exist in the script. I also thought the movie was way better at setting up the mystery of what was happening with these characters than it was at solving it. And I thought the solution to the mystery, where we find out, oh, they were kids, they knew each other, they were both abducted, and they got these special abilities, it was really just done in one big exposition dump. And it was done essentially via flashback. You can do these reveals via exposition dump if you are clever about it, but I didn't think the movie was that clever about it. And there are so many scripts where that's the case, where the mystery is more compelling than the solution to that mystery. I think the difference here is that I actually liked the solution. I just didn't like the way the solution was written into the screenplay. And there were moments earlier in the film where I thought, really, you couldn't think of anything better than that? Like when Josh O'Connor was running in plain sight of 30 Black Ops commandos and didn't get caught by a single one of them. Now, that might be on Steven Spielberg for staging that sequence the way that he did, but I also think that you shouldn't have a screenplay that allows you to even put a character in a situation where that might happen. As a former honest trailer writer, that was one where I would have been licking my chops going like, oh yeah, that's going in the trailer. As I said in my other review, I think that Disclosure Day was a potentially great movie that was saddled with a script that was often good, but sometimes not very good. For me, it was really Steven Spielberg's talent and the talent of his collaborators, meaning the crew and John Williams and Janusz Kaminski and his actors, that elevated the film, oftentimes above what the script was able to produce. And I guess I shouldn't put it all on David Koepp, because Steven Spielberg did also come up with the story of the film, but I think the fine details were David Koepp's because he gets the screenplay credit. But what it really proved to me is that I think that Steven Spielberg still has it as a director. I really, really do. But this movie did not bring me around at all on David Koepp as a screenwriter. I will be just as skeptical of his next movie as a screenwriter as I was of this movie as a screenwriter. And I honestly think that Disclosure Day, if it had had the great things that it has without some of those, what I think are poor writing flaws in the screenplay, this could have been a genuinely great movie instead of what I think was just a good one. And really, on balance, that's the reason I landed where I did with Disclosure Day. It's that the things that worked for me really, really worked, and the things that didn't work were distractions, but not deal breakers. I'm still very comfortable with my it's good rating as far as my own feelings on the film. I'm looking forward to future watches, maybe a few months down the road, to see where it actually falls once I get a little bit more distance and I can think about the film a little bit more. But I also see where a lot of the detractors come from and where a lot of the people who are saying that it didn't work come from. Now, like I said, there has been a much more concentrated and focused negative reaction for this movie than I was expecting, honestly, for any movie. But a lot of the complaints I do understand. But what do you think? Did this help to illuminate my initial thoughts on the movie anymore? Do you think that it was good? Do you think that it was bad? Do you think that the negativity is outweighing the positive stuff for any reason other than the fact that most people apparently didn't like the movie? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching the channel. Be sure to stay tuned right here for the latest in movie news, reviews, box office, and more. Until next time, stay safe
and I'll see you then. Bye.